Hello. So today we are going to finish up our section on anaerobic systems and anaerobic power. And some of the information that we are going to cover today will primarily include information related to the anaerobic testing. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll forward through these slides to get to slide 11-ish, which I think is where we left off in class last, and we were talking about anaerobic testing. So okay, so again, we've been talking about these various anaerobic tests that we have. Again, we kind of classified them into anaerobic power and anaerobic capacity types of tests. And how do we select a test? So we should select a test that will employ the muscle groups that are involved in the sport. So again, if there's some way for us to kind of mimic that sport in our test, that would be great in terms of the specificity of the test and really giving us accurate data in terms of prediction of performance, which is really a primary reason why we would complete these types of tests. Also, it's important for us to think about the energy pathways that are important for that particular sport or event. So again, if we're doing a sport where it's really ATP phosphocreatine and it's really only 2 to 3 seconds in duration, then it's really important that we try to mimic those energy systems within the particular test that we select. Now, on the contrary, if the anaerobic glycolytic pathways are really important for the performance of that particular sport, then it's important that we try to utilize those and try to kind of max those out in a test in order for us to truly get a good glimpse at our efficiency within that particular system. So again, we talked about anaerobic power, which really represents that ATP phosphocreatine system. We can do a static jump and a counter movement jump. Again, we did those in class. We also did the Margarita Kalaman stair climb and sprint performance. Now, when we look at each of these tests, we can also look at this within that realm of that ATP PCR system. So when we do the static jump, the counter movement jump, and the Margarita Kalaman stair climb tests, again, we're not necessarily maxing out that energy system. So again, a static jump should only take me a second or two to complete. So therefore, we're really not getting to the phosphocreatine side of that energy system when we do those tests. Even when we do the 60-yard dash, which is what we did in this class, we're really not maxing out that system. In order for us to really get to the edge of the ATP phosphocreatine system, it would be better for us to do maybe something like we could do 10 vertical jumps kind of back to back. So 10 consecutive jumps and looking at our power output for that. Maybe that takes us about 12 seconds to complete. So therefore, we're trying to fatigue that particular system. Doing something more like a 100-meter dash might get us to the edge of that ATP PCR system. If I'm doing something that's 12 seconds or somewhere in that range, again, that's going to be a pretty good measure for us to kind of look at that maximal fatigability when we think about that ATP PCR system. So when we think about sprint performance tests for estimating horizontal power, again, our sprinting performance is commonly measured. So it's very common for us to use a 40-yard dash in order for us to kind of quantify or predict athletic performance in a variety of sports. Okay, so again, what are we looking at? The various elements of this particular test. We'll look at our ability to exert not only horizontal force, but also a little bit of vertical force as well. Our ability of the bioenergetic system. So again, the further that sprint gets, so if I get to 80 meters, 90 meters, 100 meters, I'm really looking at that top end ATP PCR system versus if I look at something like a 40 or even a 60-yard sprint. Again, we're kind of looking for not only acceleration, but max velocity as well. Okay. Again, this will also be dependent on our muscle fiber composition or our muscle fiber type. And in order for us to do well in this particular type of test, we want to have a lot of fast twitch fibers, which is our type 2 fibers. Again, sprinting tests are often used to evaluate horizontal power generating capacity, but they don't necessarily actually measure power output, which is really interesting. So when we do the Wingate test, which we'll talk about in a little bit, we're actually able to quantify power output because we're looking at the wattage that we push into the pedals. When we do sprint testing, we just simply look at time. So in order for us to actually measure or understand our power output, it would be important for us to look at stride frequency, knee drive would be important, and also the person's body weight. Because again, the more I weigh, the greater the power output needs to be in order for me to move at a particular speed. Okay. Horizontal power is used when we test, like we said, sprinting activities. We could do a 30, 40, 60-yard sprint. Again, in this class, we did a 60-yard sprint, taking time at the 10, 40, 50, and 60 so that we can understand max velocity, acceleration, and deceleration. Again, if we were to look at this in an athletic perspective, 40-yard dash is a really common test that we would use in order for us to kind of get a good feel for where this person is standing from a sprint perspective. So we look at jump for vertical power. Again, we're looking at our ability to express high vertical power outputs, and this will be correlated with a variety of sports, including weightlifting, sprinting, football, and soccer. Okay, so again, we see a high correlation between vertical jump and success in those particular sports. Okay, because of the simplicity of the test, jump tests are commonly used as part of a battery of tests in order for us to kind of get an overall glimpse of your fitness or your athletic capacity in sport. Again, we used a counter movement and static jumps. What was the difference? Again, with the counter movement jump, we could use that stretch recoil. We could use some momentum in order for us to complete the activity. Again, researchers have deemed the counter movement jump to be more of a skilled activity. So again, if I'm not coordinated, counter movement jump might be not as good as the static jump. And I guess my counter argument would be, that kind of basic element of athleticism is important for us to test because yes, it's a skill, but you need to have that skill if you want to be good at any particular sport. So counter movement jump, you have to kind of take that into account. If we do both of these tests in terms of assessment or in terms of the administration of kind of a battery of tests, we should start with the counter movement jumps and then go to the static jump second. Okay. Yeah. So looking at the force plate, again, this is considered our gold standard when evaluating vertical jump and power outputs. Vertical displacement is determined by quantifying flight time. Okay, so higher an individual jumps, the longer that person is off of the force plate, and so therefore we can kind of calculate what their jump is. The only issue with the force plate is we can cheat on these, so you can actually tuck your knees up underneath as you complete that jump, and that allows you to be sustained in the air for longer and without necessarily jumping any higher, but the jump or the force plate will read it as a higher number because you were suspended in the air for a longer period of time. So that is kind of one con with that. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention when we talked about sprinting, again, one kind of limitation that you should mention with our lab is we used hand time. So we measured with a stopwatch. Okay, so if we wanted to be really accurate, we would use like a laser timer or something like that, or a fully automatic timing system, and that allows us to take away the reaction time. Okay, again, the same thing when we did like the Margaria-Kalaman stair climb test. Again, the accuracy of the test is related to the timer, right? So how long, what is my reaction to press the button and press the button again, actually makes a huge difference in those short tests where those tenths of a second or hundredths of a second make a significant difference in the result at the end of the day. Anyway, I know that was a little off topic, but I forgot to mention it. So. Okay, switch mat, this is what we have in our lab. Again, this says it's relatively new technology. That should probably be updated. It's not that new anymore, I guess. But basically, how does this work? Similar to a force plate, the difference with the force plate is it takes into account the body weight of an individual. With the switch mat, again, basically we're just looking at time. So you're looking at time off the ground, and the vertical displacement will be kind of calculated based on how long this person is off the mat. Same thing with the force plate. You can cheat the system by tucking your knees under you and get a higher reading to do that. So that's kind of the only negative that we see with that one. Okay, the jump and reach. Again, the apparatus that we utilize is called the Vertec. That's the brand of this piece of equipment. You know, there's some other brands, but this is kind of like the gold standard for brands. Again, we think about cost analysis of using the Vertec versus the jump mat. The Vertec's a little bit cheaper. Again, not as portable, so it'd be easy for me to take that jump mat outside or take it over to the weight room or throw it in my car and take it to a local high school or wherever else. This is a little bit more awkward to try to move around, so that's kind of one positive that we see with the jump mat. In terms of what athletes prefer, again, I'm sure if I polled the people in our class, some of you would prefer the jump mat, some of you would prefer the Vertec. Okay. The major, I guess, con with the Vertec is you have to have skill. You have to be able to reach your hand up and hit the prongs in order for us to get an accurate reading on this. Again, you know, people consider that a skill. Well, again, if you wanted to be good at volleyball, you're going to have that skill. Or if you want to be good at basketball, you have to be able to, you know, be able to reach up and coordinate yourself in order to do that. So is that a bad thing in my mind? No, it's very you know, it's very applied, which is great when we think about how does this, what does this do for us in terms of prediction of sport performance. So again, pros and cons of using both, and certain people would prefer one over the other. From a psychological perspective, a lot of people like the Vertec because I can see where I want to reach. So, you know, in this particular image, the girl got to one level and now she's trying to get that next prong. So some people like that, being able to kind of visualize and see, and others like the jump mat just because you don't have to add the element of your arm reaching up. So kind of pros and cons of either option there. Okay, again, in order for us to determine that eccentric utilization ratio, this is something that will be completed in your lab, but basically we're looking at the difference between the counter movement and the static jump, and this will represent our ability to use that stretch shortening cycle, which might be important in many sports, sports where I don't necessarily have to react, such as something like high jump, for example. Someone who's a high jumper should have a very high eccentric utilization ratio. And again, what does that mean? Well, that means that they can kind of maximize that stretch shortening cycle in order to get a higher jump. Okay, someone like a baseball player, and again, we talked about this in class, maybe would have a low eccentric utilization ratio because they are focused more on the reaction time of quickly being able to reach up and grab a ball or whatever. So they don't have time to do the stretch shortening and use that momentum to reach up because they need to respond very, very quickly. Okay. So again, interestingly, when we think about somebody's training, a lot of that will be determined based on what the sport is and how important the use of this stretch shortening cycle might be in their success from a power perspective. Okay. So let's take a look at that Margeria-Kalaman stair climb test. Again, the textbook says it's used athletically and clinically. I've never seen it used from a clinical perspective, just because, as you noticed when you did it in class, like, it's a little risky. Again, it's a short duration, so it's less than 5 seconds. So again, we're not looking at that top end ATP PCR system. We're really looking at those first couple seconds. And again, in order for this to truly be accurate, I wanted you to have a feel for it. In order for it to be truly accurate, we would need electronic timing mats on those steps in order for us to kind of get an accurate reading, because again, we already mentioned the hand time takes into account the error level of the individual doing the timing. Okay. So again, these that we just talked about, so the Margaria test, the sprint, the vertical jumps, those were all anaerobic power tests. Now we're going to move forward and take a look at those tests for anaerobic capacity. And we've mentioned the Wingate test, which was one of the tests that you did in the lab, the anaerobic step test, which we did not do, the 300-yard shuttle test, which you either did on the turf, on the track, or in Graber Gym. And another test that's not mentioned here is the Cunningham and Faulkner treadmill test, and that's a test that you have done in the lab, and that's where the treadmill is set at a huge incline and you try to go as long as you can on the treadmill. Okay, so those 4 tests are examples of anaerobic capacity. Again, anaerobic step test we did not complete in this lab this year. Okay, so Wingate test, again, basically you're doing a cycling test for a 30-second all-out bout where we set the wattage based on where you think you can be basically in terms of fitness, but we could also set it based on body mass. We chose to not use body mass this round. We were just kind of looking at simply athleticism and where people kind of thought they would fall, and then we kind of can micro adjust it as we go. But again, a lot of you who've already done this test might have noticed like the first 10 seconds you're fine, and then it's like, oh shit, all of a sudden like, oh, it's like a brick wall. So again, you get through that ATP PCR system, and then the remainder of the test you flip over to that glycolytic system, and that's when it gets really tough and you're really having to push. So again, this test is super, I think, pretty freaking awesome because we can look at peak power, we can look at mean power, we can look at total work. We could also get a, we didn't do this year, but we could look at rate of fatigue as well. So we could create a graph where we're able to, let's see if I can just make a little drawing here. So we could create a little, well, let me do this. Anyway, it's not letting me, I'm confused, hang on. I wanted to draw for you what the fatigue test would look like. But basically we could be able to kind of track your fatigue over that 30-second bout. We didn't do that this round, but it is interesting to kind of look at, you can visually see when you're done with that ATP PCR system, which I think is pretty cool to kind of take a look at that. So. Anaerobic step test, again, as I said, we didn't use this year in class, but basically it's a 60-second test where you're stepping up on the step as many reps as you can. And again, you can kind of visually see when people start to have that lactate build up. It seems easy up front and then it gets really freaking hard towards the end. But it's a nice test that we could use for anaerobic capacity if we didn't have the lovely equipment that is needed to do the Wingate test. Okay, 300-yard shuttle. Again, the cones were 25 yards apart and you went 6 times down and back and got your average of the 2 trials. The other neat thing about the 300-yard shuttle, again, we just kind of did the standard for this, but we could use this test and kind of modify it to include specific sport parameters. So like tennis, basketball, they might have their own specific way to do this. For basketball, maybe you do it dribbling or something along those lines, so that you're able to kind of incorporate some of the skills needed in that particular sport. Okay, in order for us to do calculations, again, how do we calculate power? Power is the rate of doing work. So again, how much weight can I lift or move in relation to how fast? So again, when we look at horizontal or vertical power in this lab, you are just moving your body weight, right? But when we think about how this might apply to like the weight room, for example, it would be important for us to know not only the weight, but the speed of the bar. And we'll actually look at some of those variables in our next lab, in our muscle physiology lab, okay? Power endurance is the ability to repetitively achieve high power outputs or maintain a level of high power output. So again, might be something more like a muscular endurance type of activity. Eccentric utilization ratio is used to measure that stretch shortening cycle. So again, we're looking at the difference, or we're going to take the counter movement divided by the static jump in order for us to understand how much work was done just based on that stretch shortening cycle. Okay, the Wingate peak anaerobic power. So again, with that, you're able to determine what was the peak power that you reached, what was the highest point, the highest power point that you reached within that 30-second test. Acceleration is the rate of change of velocity per unit time. And again, you'll be able to calculate acceleration based off of your time points within that 60-yard dash. And then max velocity is the highest speed attainable by an object. So interestingly, when we look at max velocity within that 60-yard dash, some people are going to reach that at varying points. So again, when we think about velocity versus acceleration, you know, certain aspects are going to be more important in one sport versus another, in terms of, is it more important for me to be able to get up to speed fast, or is it more important for me to have a high max velocity? So again, it really varies depending on what the sport is. When we think about something like baseball, for example, I would debate that acceleration is significantly more important than max velocity. A sport like soccer, where you're really stretched out and utilizing more space, they're probably equally as important, right? We think about change of direction. It's not only important to be fast, but it's important to get up to speed fast. So both of them are important. Interestingly, when we think about both of those variables, it's kind of cool that we can separate them out and say, okay, this person is great at acceleration but needs to work on their max velocity, or vice versa. So if I'm working with somebody and I'm personal training them, or I'm a strength and conditioning coach, I can tease out those variables and then develop a specific protocol for that person based on what their strengths and weaknesses are. So the success of measurements and studying the anaerobic systems, again, all tests are going to be measures of performance. So not necessarily looking at those physiological variables like directly in a lab setting, which I think is good, right? We want these to be applicable. We want these to be like real life. So I think it is important that these tests do measure performance, because at the end of the day, that's what we're concerned with. Okay, variations in these particular tests may have a lot to do with muscular attributes and maybe not limited by energy production. Again, we think about the vertical jump, for example, that's not an energy dependent test, right? We're more concerned with max velocity and the overall cross-sectional area of a muscle. Those are variables that are important to determining my maximal vertical jump versus how much energy I have stored. Okay, variables that have the same name are measures of the same concepts, but not the actual same actual values. I have no idea what I mean there. Variables that have the same name are measures of the same concepts, but not the same actual values. I am not sure what that is supposed to mean, so just go ahead and you just cross that right out. Don't know. Sorry. So again, when we think about these tests as tests of performance, what are some of the problems, or what are some of the potential issues with this? We see some daily variance, right? So someone might have a high performance on one day and not on another, and you know, that's just kind of that's one of the things we like about sport, is the unknown, right? You could be the best person out there, but if you're inconsistent, wow, that changes the game, right? So we think about daily variance, particularly when we're working with novice athletes, we're going to see a high variance from day to day, versus our elite athletes are going to be consistent. So elite athletes will have very little daily variance. Motivation, again, how motivated am I to do well in this test might vary depending on, you know, how it was presented to me, what kind of value did the coach place in it. Learning effect, again, if you've never used the Vertec before, okay, so learning that skill and being able to kind of time when you're going to reach up is important. So again, that can affect our performance. Again, we're not directly measuring any of the physiological variables, which in my opinion is fine for what we're interested in these particular types of tests. However, it does kind of skip a step. So we're not able to necessarily measure that energy system, for example. Okay, relationships to physiological variables and other performance tests must be determined, and the accuracy of prediction can then be found. So again, we see a high amount of correlation between many of these tests and athletic performance, and so I think it's important to sell that to athletes. If we're going to actually use this as a tool to determine who's going to play and who's not going to play, then the athletes need to buy into the concept that, yeah, what your 40 is actually matters in terms of how you're going to perform as a basketball player, as a soccer player, etc. So how do we train to improve these? Okay, so training should be centered around the ATP PCR system and anaerobic glycolytic system. Again, anaerobic training must be performed at intensities above VO2 max. So again, we can do sprint or speed training where we're looking at high intensity intervals that are 2 to 10 seconds in duration. Okay, and then we need at least 30 to 60 seconds rest. If we want to do speed endurance training, again, we're looking at anaerobic training that's lasting longer than 10 seconds. So again, these might be high intensity intervals that are 20 to 60 seconds with a longer rest interval depending on their training status. So again, if they're highly trained individuals, they might need 2 to 3 minutes rest for these things. If I am not a highly trained individual, then it might be better for us to take 4 to 5 minutes between each of these repetitions. So what about the adaptations to anaerobic training? Again, in muscular activities that require near maximal force production, such as sprinting, much of the muscular needs are going to be met by the ATP PCR system and then anaerobic glycolytic system. And we're going to stop here because we're going to talk about some of these adaptations in class and how we can kind of upregulate these with chronic training.